Homage to the Triple Gem. So warm greetings everybody, this is Bhante Joe here, and we're nearing the last week, we're in the last week of First Vasa, and was asked an interesting question the other day via WhatsApp, which was, there was a gentleman and his mother, he was discussing with his mother about how the 5 khandhas are impermanent, and she could understand how all of them were impermanent, all of that made sense, except for consciousness. Consciousness didn't make sense. How do we know, for example, that there's no kind of little man hiding behind all conscious experience, and that there's basically just this one continuity of consciousness? So actually this is something that we can investigate, that a person can investigate for themselves on 2 levels. We might call a person can receive confirmation for this on a mundane level. They can receive confirmation for this on a super mundane level. So in terms of the mundane level, the Buddha describes these 6 types of consciousness, the kind of eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind consciousness. So in the suttas, it basically says about consciousness that consciousness cognizes. That's its function. It says, what does it cognize? As far as I remember, it uses like a salty, sweet, these different tastes. So you have the passive faculty of taste. In other words, something contacts it and it registers that taste. This sutta contrasts that to the eye faculty, or to perception, which uses the eye faculty. It says, what does perception perceives? And what does it perceive? It perceives red, yellow, these various things, I think, through the eye faculty. So consciousness is this aspect that basically knows. We have this aspect of experience which registers and knows the experience. And that aspect of registering or knowing is not something stable, it's not something permanent, and it depends on the faculty with which it arises. So one can see this for oneself, again in mundane terms, just basically watching the eye faculty or the ear faculty. I mean, when a person is young, say they have 20/20 vision, and then as they get older, their ability to see lessens. So that lessening of the ability to see is a lessening of eye consciousness, is a lessening of the ability to be aware at the eye. So the Buddha says that when the eye faculty is intact, the inner eye faculty, and external forms come into range, then eye consciousness arises. But if basically there's damage to the eye faculty, or if the eye faculty is intact but no external forms come into range, then it doesn't arise. So in other words, for a person who is blind, their consciousness at the eye does not arise. They kind of have this kind of blank, or at least it's impaired severely, depending on the degree of blindness. So one can see this for oneself in observing the eye faculty when one's vision is blurry. This can happen at various times when one wakes up in the morning. Actually, a lot of one's faculties are impaired when one wakes up, and the first thing one wakes up is kind of blurry, looking around, and things are not 100% clear. After a little bit of blinking, after a little bit of eye rubbing, then they become more clear. So this is consciousness at the eye. You can see this consciousness changing, this awareness through the faculty of the eye changing. And it's not something stable, it's not something permanent. The same with the ear, one can go deaf. Same with the body, one can stop feeling sensations. And with taste, all these things fade away. And the mind is the tricky one that people often associate most with themselves. So there is actually a tendency, especially in Western Buddhism at the present time, in part influenced by Advaita Vedanta, and in part somewhat influenced through theorizing, it seems. There's this tendency to regard awareness as basically being like a supreme practice, and that basically if one just observes in various ways, then that's all one has to do. One just observes phenomenon coming into range, and one accepts them being there, and eventually they fade away on their own. And so one identifies with this observer. So the implication there is that the observer is something permanent. It's not stated that way, but sometimes is, more or less. So when you have a defilement and you observe it falling away and it disappears, that thing that is there observing when the defilement disappears, that's nibbana. That's the implication. In other words, this awareness is something permanent, and there is this little man behind experience that's observing things. So the mind faculty is interesting because people have this tendency to associate it with this little man behind the scenes that's observing things. And this association is essentially Sakkaya Ditthi. It's this belief that there's something within the five khandhas, or possessing one of the khandhas. There's 4 different permutations on that is permanent, that's stable, that's self. And so, because there's this tendency to view the mind faculty that way, then it's good to investigate the mind faculty to see whether or not it's really permanent. So actually, one can see the impermanence of the mind faculty, for example, when one's consciousness decreases, when one loses consciousness. Actually, some meditators have these issues with, say, getting some rain here. We'll see how long we can continue. Some meditators have these issues with kundalini, where they practice meditation and they get this kind of release of energy. It goes up to their head, and then they even sometimes pass out or lose consciousness. So if anybody pays attention when they're losing consciousness, actually the ability to observe or cognize thoughts at the mind, to be aware, essentially decreases. It fades into this fuzziness. And then when one regains consciousness, then it's like thoughts might slowly start coming again, but one still hasn't formed perceptions truly about where one is and what the objects that are coming into range really mean in relationship to one. And what does this mean in relationship to me? Is this my stove? Is this my pen? This is a pen. What's this room? And then suddenly all these things start to come back and you have this association. So consciousness itself can fade. And it's actually perhaps most obvious in people who have some kind of mental impairment as they age, or sustain some injury to their brain or even to their body that affects their ability to think. So one of the things that we tend to see as a meditator, that one tends to see if one meditates, is just how much the body affects the mind, and the mind affects the body. So sometimes an injury in one part of the body can have effects on one's meditation, can have effects on one's ability to think, on one's ability to reason. And sometimes the greater the injury, the greater the effect. So one can observe this, the decrease and increase, the ebb and flow of one's consciousness at the mind, of one's ability to be aware of thoughts, ability to be aware of perceptions, ability to be aware of mental objects in general, and that awareness itself, how it comes and goes, how it fades. It's not something stable. And so it's not something that should be grasped onto as a self. It's not a continuity of awareness throughout, like this stable awareness that switches from the eye to the ears to the nose to the tongue to the body to the mind. It depends on the integrity of the internal sense faculty and, to a certain extent, the clarity of the external sense object that comes into contact with it to determine just how clear consciousness is, just how stable it is. So observing this is something that one can do relatively easily, especially for the physical faculties, for sight and sound, taste, touch, smell. It's easy enough to see how these things can fade and come and go. But one of the interesting one is to try to observe this with the mind, especially when one meditates, if one has a good meditation or one's meditation is going well, and one's thinking processes, when finishing meditation, might seem more clear. One's ability to be aware of the thoughts seem more clear. And what makes that dull? What dulls that down? If one eats a certain food that one's allergic to, or one accidentally ingests some kind of intoxicant, some kind of something that's slightly intoxicating, or coffee or tea or something like this, what effect does that have on one's consciousness at the mind? In observing in this way, one can see this thing constantly changing, and one can develop a certain amount of dispassion for this consciousness. So that's on the mundane level of consciousness. And one of the things is that, especially in Western philosophy was more focused on the I. There was this brilliant essay, a brilliant point made by Ajahn Thanissaro, among many brilliant points, that Western philosophy was focused on the I. In other words, is what we see real? Whereas Eastern philosophy, Indian philosophy, was focused on the tongues. How can I get a stable source of food? How can I find a permanent source of food? So the Buddha's aim in teaching about the impermanence of consciousness, the impermanence of the five aggregates, wasn't necessarily to establish, say, like a view that a person then takes up and believes in, because one's ability to test what the Buddha teaches increases the more one develops one's meditation, the more the range of one's, the subtlety of one's investigation, the deeper the subtlety of one's investigation goes, the greater one's ability is to test the Buddha's teachings. And the greater one's ability is to see what he really meant. Sometimes quite often the Buddha in his brilliance basically uses like a single word or a small phrase that describes a whole category of experience. And the phrase is accurate, it's succinct, and it accurately describes that category of experience. It's often given, it's given by the Buddha, not often, basically all the time, in a way that it leads onwards. It leads one to want to practice, to realize what he's teaching. But in a sense, it is a kind of category. So there's much more that one could say about these things, but it's to be experienced by the people who practice. So one's ability to test these things can increase the more that one meditates. But more importantly, the Buddha's teachings in these regards, in terms of Indian philosophy, they're meant to help, they're aimed at an end, which is to help one find an end to the need to feed. In other words, these aggregates, these five aggregates are called the panchupadana khandha. They're things that we cling to, and by clinging to them, we basically keep them going. So in other words, we're feeding. A person is feeding on these aggregates, and so his teachings are aimed at putting an end to this feeding. So what one wants to use these teachings for all along is actually to develop dispassion for these things, to see how clinging to consciousness, how clinging to one's ability to think clearly, even one's ability to perceive at the mind. Like, if one gets a neck injury, then that can really affect one's ability to think clearly. I mean, so many things can affect one's consciousness at the mind. It's constantly changing as one grows sleepy or falls in and out of sleep. And the more that one associates with this idea that I am this person, I have this self, the easier it is to fall into suffering whenever that idea is challenged. And this is especially pernicious in the West, that I have this personality, I'm this particular type of person. So what one wants to use these teachings is not so much in terms of the I, like, is this really real or not? Is there really a man behind experience or not? And then try to think about that logically to prove or disprove it. What one wants to use it is in terms of the tongue, in terms of trying to find an end to feeding. And in this way, one can gradually let go of these five aggregates. So that's what you might call the mundane way. The super mundane way is that beyond these kind of consciousness at the six sense media, there's what the Buddha calls anidasana vijnana, or consciousness without feature. And this is something that can only be realized. So rain has come very quickly now. So I think that's probably enough of an explanation. It's enough to know that the purpose of the Buddha's teachings about consciousness is not to prove them intellectually, but to try to find an end to these five aggregates and to find a safety that lies beyond them. And the steps that we can use to get there are by contemplating consciousness in these mundane ways, seeing how it's impermanent at the eye, the ear, the nose, the tongue, the body, and the mind, and setting our hearts on a safety that's beyond these things. So I think I'll leave that for reflection and maybe try to get out of the rain.